welcome to On Trial, starring Mark Radulich, also starring Sean Comer. Hope you're ready, Hollywood, because you're on trial.
All rise. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Ito presiding. This is On Trial Civil Court Edition, and I am your host, your mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich. And joining me tonight on the opposite side of the courtroom, ladies and gentlemen, he's Sean, you're not, Sean Comer. How do you do, sir?
Patty Hughes representing the plaintiff, sir.
Outstanding.
I had to reach on this one. I couldn't go with prosecutor or defense, so I had to think, okay, what's the of all the legal shows that I've watched, who is my favorite civil litigator? And I thought Glenn Close, Damages, Patty Hughes. Who else?
Well done, sir.
Yeah, try as you might have to have thrown me off my game with your little pre-trial mind games.
Oh, I didn't. Oh, you didn't know we were doing Jurassic Park versus Pulp Fiction tonight? Ah.
No, leading into the show, this is, of course, this case is for custody of the 1994 Best Picture Academy Award.
95, I'm sorry.
Hey, look, you got one wrong. I can be a year off, okay? The 1995 Best Picture Academy Award. Currently, Forrest Gump holds full custody. I am arguing on behalf of the jilted true parent, The Shawshank Redemption. And Mark and I are talking about this unique format because normally we do kind of a Lincoln Douglas debate kind of thing. And he's talking about, okay, I'm going to just talk about the merits of Pulp Fiction. You're going to talk about Shawshank. I said, wait. Pulp Fiction? Mark, which movie did you watch? Because I prepared my case based on Shawshank and Forrest Gump. I watched Forrest Gump. I don't know why I said Pulp. Yeah. Sure.
My brain not works so good.
It's and in my head as I think about this new take on our show, I'm thinking back to one of my favorite Tori Amos live tracks. Her live version of Happy Phantom from Legs of Boots, which opens with the improvised intro. I'm not gonna fuck this one up. I'm not gonna fuck this one up. It's kind of adorable. I recommend you go track it down. Anyway,
I do enjoy Boys for Pele. It's a great album.
Part of me wants to say, oh, I didn't know you appreciated Tori Amos, but then the other part realizes, then again, I also have known you to never want to miss it's not Sister Hazel. I feel bad for blanking on the name of it. Sister Hazel or Delamitri?
It ain't Delamitri.
That you kind of have a little bit of a penchant. Okay, no, that's me who kind of likes Delamitri.
No, my wife is a big Sister Hazel fan, so I've seen them.
Oh, it's Melissa likes Sister Hazel. Okay.
Yeah, I've seen Sister Hazel now as many times as I've seen Slayer, because it's the only band she wants to go see in concert.
Yeah, that's right. I keep forgetting both Melissa and I our differing opinions on certain TV shows that will not be named notwithstanding, do share a certain fondness for both Sister Hazel and Say Anything.
That is correct.
Yeah.
With that said, now that we got that all out of the preamble out of the way.
Although, guys, please try for just a moment before we present our respective cases. Just take a calming, soothing breath. Enter your Zen place and try to put yourself into the mind frame of one Mark-mandated reporter Radulich as he rocks right the fuck out to All For You. Or a walk through hell.
I do enjoy a walk through hell. So this is the summer of Sean. I put together the schedule usually about 6 months to a year in advance, and it's usually based on the Damn You Hollywood schedule. So I try to. So for example, let's say like next year Godzilla has a new movie coming out. We're gonna do an on trial of the 98 Godzilla with Matthew Broderick. So that's a little bit of how the sausage is made. I pretty much pick movies based on whatever's out in theaters now that we can kind of look back on and evaluate. But not every month and not every movie has something that fits the on trial mold. So on the weeks or the months that I don't really have anything in mind, I pitch it to Sean and I say, Sean, pick a movie. And I generally don't give him any parameters. If there's something that I really want to do, I just put it on the schedule. And if I don't have any dog in the hunt, I turn to Sean and go, Sean, hit me with your best shot. So as it turns out, this summer, especially with all the movies changing dates and years and whatnot, there just came a series of shows, a slew of shows, if you will, where Sean got to pick everything. And it became the summer of Sean. We started with Battleship, and it brings us to tonight's show here in the month of June. What made you decide to want to do this, and what is the 1995 Oscar debate all about? What's some of the background here, Sean?
Well, first off, as to why I wanted to do it, this may go down as one of my favorite podcasts ever, because, little known fact, The Shawshank Redemption is my one quintessential all-time favorite movie. Hands down, I don't think it's even close. There are others I have some sentimental ties to, but as far as the one that is just first one out of my mouth whenever somebody asks me that question, that's it. That's the one. And I wanted a way to talk about it on one of our shows, but just there wasn't really room within any of the formats. It didn't really fit Long Road to Ruin because it wasn't part of a franchise. This one, I didn't want to do it in the traditional format because this might be one of the only ones where I could have possibly gotten a little bit defensive at hearing it potentially derided. And also, I don't think there is or should be much debate about the actual quality of it. So forcing somebody to actually sort of prosecute it, so to speak, I think would have been an exercise in futility. It would have felt forced, it would have been exceptionally disingenuous, and I don't think it would have made for a good show. But then I thought back, and I went, you know what, the 1995 Best Picture Oscar is one of those wherein, at the time, you couldn't have really argued against the movie that won, which was, again, Forrest Gump. Except for the fact that later you consider that it was competing against what is widely regarded of the greatest films ever made in any era. Period. And that hold up said well decades later, and that's Pulp Fiction and The Shawshank Redemption. And you will even find people who will argue one way or another that screw Forrest Gump, Pulp Fiction should have won. It's an independent icon. And then others who will say, no, screw them both, Shawshank should have won. It's timeless in its beauty, in its subtext, in its poignancy. It's one of the few movies that could be regarded as virtually perfect in nearly every way. And I thought, now that would be interesting. Is what if we turned our courtroom into a civil court and argued for custody of that little gold babby, that adorable little gilded bundle of joy, the Best Picture Academy Award. And so I decided, okay, this is perfect. I get to champion my sacred cow, and we can make interesting arguments both ways for, you know, the pure feel-good nature of Forrest Gump and its status as just perpetually uplifting cinematic candy. Or you can look at Shawshank and see it as the ultimate underdog story that actually didn't really get its due until well after the Academy Awards. And in fact, when it was first released, it was a box office flop. It was critically acclaimed, but as far as being a moneymaker, no, it tanked. It tanked right up until the Oscar race. So I just saw it as a different angle. And it's the same reason why I wanted to talk about Dances with Wolves, is because instead of talking about a patently bad movie and trying to chat up its merits and say, oh, no, it's underappreciated, it didn't get its due, it's more of, okay, here's another one that was lauded both immediately before and immediately after the Oscars for being one of the most sweeping cinematic epics of its time. But how does this bloated 3-hour period drama hold up more than 20 years later? So it's just a way to kind of take things in a little bit of a different direction, put a new spin on some of these movies. And who knows, maybe this won't even be the last time that we ever have a discussion like this.
Okay.
Oh, and by the way, I will be back in just a moment because my bacon stuffed mushrooms are ready, and I need to go fix a plate. So this will be just a brief recess, so I can get a little snacky brew.
Okay, folks, we're back, and here we go. The opening salvo, round one, if you will. Why Forrest Gump should have, as it did, win the 1995 Best Picture Oscar. Look, no one on this podcast is going to argue that any of the nominees that year were not well-made, competent movies. But we're talking about the Best Picture winner, the Best Picture nominee. And I'm a man who likes parameters, who likes to define terms. It can't just be a well-made movie, because then how could you pick a winner? Lots of movies are well-made, competently made, etc. I believe it has to transcend the typical movie experience, not just tell a well-told tale. I think the Best Picture nominee needs to not have a miss when it comes to craft across the board. Its setting has to look realistic and entertaining and engulfing and bright. I believe its performances have to snap and be convincing, more so than any other performance it's being judged against. I believe its story, as I said before, needs to transcend the typical narratives in the motion picture industry. I believe the Best Picture nominee needs to not just entertain, but speak to the zeitgeist, speak to a general experience for the audience. I think there needs to be truth. Forrest Gump is all of that. Forrest Gump presents, now, some would say, oh, well, it's an idiot, and he has no great take on anything happening around him except for this very confined sort of single view of, his love towards this woman who was an absolute train wreck. But in Forrest Gump, there is room for all of us to experience some of the most tumultuous decades in American history. See, Forrest Gump speaks for us, the audience, as passengers. As he takes you through this ride through the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. Forrest Gump has one of the great leading character performances of all time. I know it gets lampooned in other movies, you know, you never go full retard and all of that. But, truthfully, Tom Hanks is probably one of the best actors of the last 50 years. In terms of being able to create a character out of whole cloth and stay convincingly in that character without doing some Jared Leto nonsense, meta nonsense, you know, always having to stay in character. You know, no, Tom Hanks is so good that he can just perform and convince you that Tom Hanks the man has slipped away, and in steps this character that he's created. Forrest Gump, for all the criticisms that are out there, is an interesting character because and he's this amalgamation of not hypocrisies but opposites, if you will. You know, he's borderline mentally retarded, but he has these, you know, sometimes brilliant insights. They're very simple but brilliant insights. He's a man who has great luck. It's luck I think some of us envy, to be in the right place at the right time all the time. You know, to have suffered the slings and arrows of prejudice and hatred, but have come out the other end, nary a hate for anyone, and just wanting to live his life, you know, and contribute to the lives of those he's touched and make them better. When you think about like how he interacts with, say, Bubba, for example, or Lieutenant Dan, Gary Sinise's character. So, but he's not alone. You have Sally Fields. You have the lady who plays Jenny. Obviously, you have Gary Sinise. There's not a bad performance in the movie. You could argue, and I will get to it later, that there are some performances in some of these other movies that were nominated in the year 1995, but there's not a single bad performance in Forrest Gump. They are all exceptional. Forrest Gump, for a non-fantasy film, for a film that's grounded in history, it's a period piece of sorts, really does take you away from where you are in the world and brings you to those places and those times, which is a triumph, especially in modern filmmaking. Then you have, like, special effects, right? And when you think of special effects, you think of Star Wars, you think of Star Trek, you think of Jurassic Park, which was nominated that year. You know, you think movie magic. What better movie magic than the subtle film clips of Forrest Gump interacting with dead presidents? John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson. These were great. And totally believable. That when I watch those scenes today, when I look back on them, I'm really mesmerized by what they were able to accomplish with that footage and how seamlessly they are able to insert Tom Hanks in there. It's great. You don't always need to see the Death Star blowing up to notice how great special effects can be. Sometimes it's just put a little man interacting with JFK telling him that he has to pee. Or pulling his pants down in front of, I believe it was Lyndon Johnson. That's good stuff. So, talk about the settings. I don't want to start comparing it to the other movies now, but, you know, for rural Alabama and Vietnam and Washington, D.C., these were some very bright and picturesque settings. It really takes you there. And they're grand. Forrest Gump travels the world. You really get to see different times and places in this movie, as opposed to sort of a modern seedy LA or a prison. One single setting. Forrest Gump, the settings in Forrest Gump are a triumph. So, I could go on. But when you take the measure of a movie and you say, well, what makes it the best? As I said, it has to fire on all cylinders, and it has to be better than its competitors in every category. And there isn't a category in Forrest Gump where I can see another movie from that year where it told a better story, a more engrossing story, a story where large portions of the audience could identify with Forrest. Whether it's, I remember that if you're older, if I remember that historical incidents, or just the feeling of giving your heart to a woman just to have her throw it out the window and run away on you. And then only come back when she has nowhere else to go. And even still run away again. At the core of Forrest Gump is a story of heartbreak. And who can't identify with that? Yes, you have your underdog stories, but I think but isn't Forrest the ultimate underdog? A guy born, little not so intelligent, and a curved back, and he needs braces, and he has all of these things working against him, and yet he triumphs. If you're looking for an underdog story, why not Forrest Gump? And then why shouldn't it win the Best Picture when it exceeds on all levels? You done with your mushrooms there, bud?
I am, and holy shit, are they delicious. I should have made a double batch. Leftovers would have been grand. Anyway, onward to the story of the Shawshank Redemption. Hey, speaking of underdog stories, this is a movie that, all things considered, should have probably failed in every conceivable way. This was a gamble in every sense of the word. Columbia Pictures and Castle Rock Entertainment placed their wager down with a $25 million budget on a Stephen King story sold for $5,000 to Frank Darabont in 1987, with no female characters, a somewhat confusing title, and the overall unpopularity of prison films strapped to it. Now, I want to point out first is I've read two sides of this story, just to be absolutely clear. One said that the one that I had always been told previously was that King actually sold Darabont The Shawshank Redemption for the princely sum of a whole $1. The other that I read indicated that no, it was King actually sold Darabont his short story The Woman in the Room in 1983, just trying to help a new director establish his resume. And it was then 4 years later when Darabont came to King with $5,000, which still not exactly a king's ransom, to purchase the rights to adapt Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, a 96-page novella culled from King's 1982 work Different Seasons. But what is not disputed is that ultimately King never cashed the check. In fact, he later framed it and sent it back to Darabont with a note that simply said, quote, "In case you ever need bail money, love, Steve." But at the time, here's what it took to get to where we are right now. This was, for as wonderful a cast as this boasts, when you take into consideration the likes of not just Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman in the leads, but the fantastically underappreciated Bob Gunton as Warden Samuel Norton, Clancy Brown as the sadistic homicidal guard Hadley, William Sadler, Gil Bellows, and of course James Whitmore as Brooks. As impressive as that cast is, it initially could have actually been even grander, because along the way, one A-lister after another was taken off the board as they looked to fill their personnel, their cast of players out. At one point, Gene Hackman, Robert Duvall, Clint Eastwood, and Paul Newman were all considered, but either passed or became unavailable. Believe it or not, Tom Hanks was offered the role of Andy Dufresne, but he passed it up in order to take the lead in Forrest Gump. Kevin Costner was offered the role. He said no thanks because he chose to do Waterworld. I'm not making this up. Tom Cruise was brought in on table readings of the script, but he decided that Darabont was too inexperienced for him to work under. Ultimately, Darabont went with Tim Robbins because he was wowed by his 1990 performance in the utter psychological horror classic Jacob's Ladder. When Robbins was brought on board, Robbins insisted that Darabont retain the services of veteran cinematographer Roger Deakins, who he had worked with previously on the Hudsucker Proxy. Brad Pitt at one point was supposed to take on the role of the tragic young convict Tommy. And that was based on his success but actually he dropped out after he became kind of a cult success in Thelma and Louise, and the role instead went to Bellows. James Gandolfini passed up the chance to portray Boggs, the unforgettable prison rapist. Bob Gunton, actually, there's an interesting story that when he came to audition for the role, his head was still shaved from his recent part in Demolition Man. So they had to have a wig made for him. Because Gunton insisted that Norton should have hair that could be, grayed out as his on-screen aging progressed over the course of, I believe it's 20 years of Andy Dufresne's sentence. And he even continued to use the wig in early scenes of the film as his hair grew back. So at times, this was a tale of people putting together a movie with what they had to hopefully attain what they wanted. Right down to the fact that Robbins studied up for the role. You want to talk kind of about method acting. He watched caged animals in a zoo to get a feel for their tense desperation. He spent an afternoon in actual solitary confinement. He had conversations with both prisoners and guards. He spent hours with his arms and legs shackled just to get a true, authentic feel for it, or as much as possible. On the other hand, Clancy Brown passed up the opportunity to interview other prison guards because he was very self-conscious of the possibility that playing such a brutal son of a bitch might actually be inspired by actual correctional officers. I'm kind of going. I've got such a litany of notes about why I love this movie. It's sometimes kind of hard to know, sort of where to start. But what it boils down to is this movie had a $25 million budget, which is, to put it extraordinarily mildly, modest. Headed into the Oscar race, despite it being by and large an utter critical darling, it failed to even make that back. In fact, domestically, its original run brought in only $16 million, which would have condemned it to a $9 million loss. However, after the Academy Awards, a theatrical re-release, and immense international popularity ultimately kicked the totals up to the more respectable $58.3 million. Keep in mind, before you write that off entirely, we're talking about mid-90s dollars. And upon its home video release, it became one of 1995's most rented films. Its popularity and influence and its place in history then grew even more after, and this is actually how I came to be acquainted with it, because in 1995 I was only in junior high. There was no way I was getting into an R-rated movie, and as strict as my folks were, I wasn't even allowed to watch Bram Stoker's Dracula, which we had on home video. But the thing was, I caught it eventually anyway because Turner Broadcasting bought the rights, and there was a period of about a year when it was aired on TNT on, and I'm not even remotely exaggerating this, a nearly daily basis. You think about the jokes that you hear at the holidays sometimes about the time when the copyright, the copyright on It's a Wonderful Life lapsed. And so any network that wanted to could show it completely gratis over the holidays anytime they wanted to. That's kind of what it felt like after Turner acquired the Shawshank Redemption. It was like a combination of on Turner, the programming was about 99% professional wrestling and the NBA and the Shawshank Redemption. If you flipped it over to TBS, it shifted to Atlanta Braves baseball, professional wrestling, and a league of their own. So you can kind of catch either one just about any time of day. It's kind of like the old joke about the early days of HBO, that the initials HBO stood for, hey, Beastmaster's on. It's kind of like that. But as to the movie itself, it is an uncommonly malleable, inspirational story of white-collar banker Andy Dufresne, who in 1947 is sentenced to spend life in Maine's Shawshank State Penitentiary on 2 consecutive life sentences for a crime he apparently did not commit. I say apparently because that's a mystery we have to unravel over the course of the movie. And as much as the ending is well known, I want to do my best to not spoil anything on the off chance that somebody out there has not seen it, because, dear God, I will even accede something to the defendant in this case and point out that these are 2 movies that everybody needs to see at least once in a lifetime, maybe more. But the funny thing about it, the funny story about this tale of a man who must seek salvation within, in both a literal and metaphorical sense, as he's confined to a hopeless, brutal, unforgiving hell of a mid-century prison, where life and death were indeed of little consequence in many instances, as has been well documented by history, is that Darabont has said in the years since that he purposely wanted to set this movie up so that people could make it their own, so that they could draw their own conclusions and take their own substance away from Andy's story. For starters, there's the fact that Andy might have been dealt a bad hand as far as being framed for murder, but by his own admission, especially late in the movie, part of the title, The Shawshank Redemption, could come down to the fact that Andy comes into prison a flawed man and ultimately leaves a bigger, better, even more compassionate man than he was when he was first locked up. He wasn't perfect. From what we can gather, he was a workaholic. He considers himself to have been a cold husband who effectively pushed his wife into the arms of another man. He had more than a little bit of a drinking problem. Now, are those things that should have condemned a man to spend the rest of his living days behind bars? No. But it seems that by the time he leaves, he's found parts of himself that maybe even he never knew were there, or that he never fully appreciated, and that he couldn't have really connected with them any other way. He takes his time and he makes it his own as nourishment to the better facets of his spirit. Meanwhile, at the same time, he's also changing the people around him. So much so that by the end of the movie, Andy's best friend, Red, played in absolutely unforgettable fashion by Morgan Freeman, acknowledges to the parole board, after throughout the movie being repeatedly denied release, that he cannot ever fully atone for his past. What's done is done. His sins are what they are. There's nothing that he can really do to call himself fully reformed, because he can't go back and change the life that he took. Meanwhile, by the time he gets out, Andy is somehow not changed by his surroundings. He isn't turned into a corrupt, rotted, brutal, unfeeling soul. It's a famine of integrity all around him. Everyone, seemingly from his fellow prisoners right up to the guards, and especially the warden. He finds that true freedom is internal. It's something that can withstand and hold the line against every unspeakable dignity that the world can possibly throw at anyone. To bust out somewhat of a hackneyed, perhaps, film school cliche, and I hope you'll forgive me, because a cliche is a cliche, but a cliche is a cliche for a reason. It is Capra-esque. It's the kind of triumph of the human spirit story that they literally don't make anymore. And yet, that's the saddest, because it's the kind of movie that you could take it back and insert it into almost any other era of film. And not only would it probably hold the same critical prestige, it would more than likely be more appreciated by audiences as well. It doesn't rewrite the book as far as grand cinematography or filmmaking technique or even script craft. In that sense, I would have to cede the floor to Pulp Fiction or Forrest Gump. Because Pulp Fiction, in terms of its story structure and dialogue, it truly is in a class by itself, regardless of how you might feel about Quentin Tarantino overall. Forrest Gump was subtly stunning, is the best way that I can possibly describe the fluidity and the seamlessness with which Tom Hanks in the mid-90s was inserted so very deftly into iconic, landmark American news footage. I don't have a bad thing to say about that. I can't bust into my usual character on this show and find some little nitpick. Hats off. It is incredible. But that being said, in that way, those movies are products of their time. They were movies that if you were to take them and to have made them at any other time, in Forrest Gump's case, the technology would not have existed to have pulled the visual effects off as effectively. And in Pulp Fiction's case, it would simply be, at best, a cult classic that would later be viewed as something that was underappreciated at its time, that never got its due, that was more forward-thinking than audiences or critics were ready for. In the case of The Shawshank Redemption, you have a movie that stands up as proof that some things just simply work, and they work in any era. And in this case, they work in incredibly compelling ways that allow anyone who watches this movie to take ownership of it in their own special, heartfelt way. And you can't really call too many takes on it any more valid than anyone else's. Because at the same time, you'll look at it and you'll realize that you're seeing it through your own frame and your own interpretations of the story and your own attachments to the characters. At the same time, you can hear somebody else's, and just as you're getting ready to argue your point about how you absorbed it and what you took away and what the true meaning of it was, this little part of you just stops and says, "No, I can see where you got that." That is a gorgeous, rare cinematic experience, especially in a time when so often we are so explicitly told, either through the movie itself or by the press of the writer and the director and the stars, exactly what a movie is supposed to be. This is something that is simply a very dynamic, human, believable tale, plain spoken in every possible sense. And yet, you could show this to anybody, and number one, they would find it believable. Number two, they would connect to it simply based on the fact that nothing in life remains static. Everything either changes or falls behind and is cast to the wayside. And most importantly, everything about it just feels like it makes good filmmaking look so easy and so simple. That's impossible not to appreciate, except for the fact that, as I will point out shortly, I think the Academy suffered from a case of misplaced priorities. I return the floor to you, sir.
All right, well, let's keep the conversation on the Shawshank Redemption going, shall we? I laid out my case as these are all good movies with well-performing, with good performing actors, great settings, interesting, well-told stories, all of that. So we're talking about nuances here. Now, Sean said earlier that he couldn't much handle someone taking the piss out of one of his favorite movies, The Shawshank Redemption. I'm not here to do that. I'm not here to tell you that The Shawshank Redemption's a bad movie. It's not. That would be silly. But when you compare it to just Forrest Gump by itself, okay, I'm not going to get into Pulp Fiction and Jurassic Park. When you think about, let's talk about the most obvious thing. talk about cinematography and settings and all of that. You have one location in the Shawshank Redemption. You have this prison. So one could argue that it effectively builds this really interesting world that most people will never get an opportunity to experience. Certainly, in terms of a period piece, many of us in 2018 are not going to be living in a prison in the 40s or the 50s. I think that's pretty plainly obvious. So the first thing that the Shawshank Redemption has to do is build this world. And then it has to share with you, it has to do world building. Now, world building is one of those things where you typically hear that in like a fantasy film, Marvel, that sort of thing. What are you trying to tell me, sir? Anyway.
Sorry, I wasn't trying to tell you anything. I was literally trying to glance at something on my phone real quick, and I accidentally swiped that fucking thumb on Facebook Messenger.
And I'm looking at that going, thanks for agreeing with my point, but let me finish.
No. That was... You know that I have occasionally ribbed you a little bit by quietly sending you messages to crack your shit up. This was not one of those times. I'm trying to take this seriously, so I apologize for that.
Not a problem. All right, moving on. So there's some world building that has to happen to take you to this. I'm going to use the term fantastic place, but certainly one could argue that a prison in the 40s and 50s is not exactly the stuff of fantasy. But it is an alien world, isn't it? Most people will not have experienced prison, let alone prison decades ago. So there's a fair amount of world building that has to take place even before you get to Andy Dufresne's story. I'm not here to comment on the merits of the story. So I think it can be said, though, that it's not a universal story. Sure, he's an underdog, and I think taken at the most base level, at the most simplest level, could we all identify with somebody, dealing with an untenable situation with unsurmountable odds and coming out of it a better person? Maybe. Okay, sure. But again, when you compare that to Forrest Gump, I don't think there is I don't think there is a comparison here. Who doesn't identify with Forrest? Some people aren't going to identify with Andy Dufresne. That is the strength of Forrest versus the Shawshank Redemption. While many people might be entertained by the Shawshank Redemption, not everybody relates to it. Not everybody finds the value in the con being rehabilitated, finding his sense of self, his humility, all of the things that go into it. And one could even argue that maybe doesn't even happen in the Shawshank Redemption. But I don't want to get into a whole debate about was this not a long con? Did Andy really learn anything from this experience? Did he not get what was coming to him? That sort of thing. I think that's a debate for another podcast. But I will say that the Shawshank Redemption, I don't believe, speaks to everyone universally, and therefore is not a better movie than Forrest Gump. Let's talk about some performances. I think when you look at Tom Hanks, as I said before, it's a real tour de force. Now let's compare that to Tim Robbins. Tim Robbins, for at least a third of the movie, has to look sullen. And then for another third of the movie, he's unobtrusive. He's just kind of there. He's slyly trying to figure out his way to get what he needs, subtly manipulating the guards, that sort of thing. But it's still, look, it's not a bland performance as such, as I think that is exactly the character he was going for. But interesting is interesting, and bland is bland. And there's something very dynamic about Tom Hanks portraying this Forrest character versus Tim Robbins playing the decidedly and definitely, befitting of the story, this melancholy Andy Dufresne. Because whom amongst us wouldn't be melancholy if we were up for 2 consecutive life sentences for a murder we never committed? Whose only sin is we worked a little too hard and maybe we were a little neglectful of our wives. I would be pretty sad, too. I don't know if I would have ever come out of my cell. I don't know, if that's the world I even would want to live in. So I get that, but as an audience member, I still have to watch it. And I'll tell you, I just rewatched The Shawshank Redemption, and God, if it's not for Morgan Freeman and some of the other roughnecks and sweat hogs in that movie, he can become unbearable at times. It's just, you're waiting for him to turn it on and become charismatic and become somebody you want to root for, who finally gets one over on the warden at the end. But aren't there much more interesting characters in The Shawshank Redemption as opposed to Forrest Gump, where the most interesting character is its lead? Finally, about Shawshank. About the story. It's a meandering tale, don't you think? Just kind of, this is a day in the life of a prison, in the days of yesterday. Things happen. Bums get raped. It's a sad, sad story. Meanwhile, Forrest takes you on a journey. And there's no raping. No
raping.
There was no raping in Forrest Gump, says Newsweek. But
I'm now imagining the old classic voiceover style trailers where they would call some perfectly cherry picked snippet of a review. Roger Ebert says, "No butt sex."
Siskel Ebert gave it a thumbs up and say there was no raping to be seen. I honestly wasn't even gonna belabor that point, but I got a laugh out of you, so I had to run with it. Let me get back on track. So Forrest takes you on a journey from rural Alabama and his mother's house to college, to Nam, to China, to Washington, D.C., back to Alabama again. He takes you all over the world. Where does Andy take you? Andy takes you to the dusty corners of a prison run by a corrupt warden. And that's not to say there isn't anything valid or interesting or even fun about that story, but we're comparing here. The Shawshank Redemption is a great movie. It's not the best. The best is Forrest Gump. You're a witness, sir.
Let's face it, folks. Great Oscar bait is still, well, Oscar bait. And, guys, Forrest Gump, the story of a mentally challenged serial killer who will touch your lives. Mama always said it puts the lotion on its skin or it gets the hose again.
We are mixing our metaphors.
We're mixing our Oscar winners. Anyway, I'm here. I'm caring about things. Yeah, minutes after I said, I'm trying to take this seriously. And let's face it, Forrest Gump is one of the quintessential examples of Oscar bait. There's a reason why it was brought up in that famous scene in Tropic Thunder as the complete definition of why you never go full retard. Is because, and historically, and I would defy you to convincingly tell me otherwise, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences loves them a story about someone with a mental handicap. I'm not even going to apologize for saying that because it's true. This does happen to be one of the better told such stories out there. But at the same time, Shawshank feels less pandering and more earthy. What you have with Forrest Gump is you have a story of astounding accomplishments. And it isn't without its own internal merit. The whole idea of doing what you do simply for the love of doing it and wanting to do it, and not just wanting to do it, but to do it the best you can, whatever it happens to be. Whether you're playing football, running cross country, fighting in Vietnam, playing ping pong, shrimping, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The true formula to happiness is simply do what makes you happy, put your all into it, and if you're not happy doing it, take that as a sign that you should maybe be doing something else. That goes right down to whoever you choose to love. Do it unreservedly, unapologetically, without judgment. No matter what, that it's one of the most precious, life-affirming things that you can do. To be able to say, I love you so much I don't care what you think. Meaning you don't even care if that person really loves you back. You just love them wholeheartedly. That's Forrest and Jenny the whole way. And that is beautiful. But when you really boil it down, Forrest, past a certain point, especially after you see a movie with such a subtle internal journey as what you see Andy Dufresne take, and what you see Red and the other convicts undergo, and even to a certain extent what you see from the warden and Hadley at times, or at least the other guards. Forrest sometimes doesn't feel so much like a character as just more of a thing that happens to people. Yes, both stories are tales of the idea that these are two people who are not changed by the world that they live in. But in Shawshank's case, it's a man whose sense of self is forced to improvise ways to survive in a hopeless, desolate, violent environment that seems bound and determined every single day to wear him down just a little bit further. And it doesn't change him for the worst. It doesn't bring out the worst in him. Instead, it ends up bringing out the best in him. It shows him a deeper appreciation for the value of human life. It makes more clear to him what makes life worth living, and how much there is inside every human being, every single one, just without fail, that can never be taken away. It just depends on sometimes how clearly you're shown it and how willing you are to accept it. In Forrest Gump's case, yeah, it's interesting watching him kind of play some small part in the course of American history, or even sometimes just kind of being a bystander to it, even if he isn't really a big wheel in what's going on. But it's not exactly what I would call a layered or ambitious feel-good story. I struggled with how to put this, and I'm still not sure that in my notes I have it exactly right. But it's what I'm going to go with. It's an inspiring story, but it's one that doesn't exactly make you think too hard about it. It's witty, it's quotable, but from top to bottom, it often reads like a Hallmark card. Again, Forrest never really grows from start to finish. He just kind of always has the same experiences, and he's the same guy throughout, and the charming part is just you see the simplicity sometimes that shines through and you realize was really kind of present in the undercurrent of so many of these moments. You know, the idea that when he went to Vietnam, yeah, I mean he acknowledges that he lost his best friend and everything over there was horrible and violent and otherworldly. But I mean, there's a believable sense of he was just told what to do and he went and did it the best that he could. He just threw his all into it. And yeah, you could see a lot of people going into Vietnam with that mindset, and possibly the lucky ones coming out with it. If I had to compare them to food, I would say that The Shawshank Redemption is something like a plate of biscuits and gravy, or a good pot roast, or a meatloaf. It's something that you digest it, and that taste lingers. But even after the taste is gone, it sticks to you. You hold on to it. It's there, and you can feel it. From my experience, and by all means, I acknowledge mileage may vary, but when it comes to Forrest Gump, it's kind of sometimes more like candy or Chinese food to me. I may remember it. I might extremely fondly even. I mean, there are certain kinds of candy and Chinese food that was so uncommonly good. Yeah, I remember the taste of it. But ultimately, and both movies are extremely quotable. They're entrenched in the zeitgeist, and maybe that's part of the beauty of Forrest Gump, is the fact that it has a kind of easily translatable, homespun sort of wisdom about it. But still, at the same time, it's just the story of one man who happens to history. That's kind of what it comes down to. And as far as the actual film craft goes, I compare it to one of my favorite episodes of Home Improvement. Just stay with me here. I am going somewhere with this. In it, it was one of the Tim Taylor versus Bob Vila episodes, wherein Bob comes on the show and they're talking about their respective hot rods. Bob is talking about his that he just bought. Tim is talking about his that he's building from scratch in the garage. And at the end of it, they end up agreeing to a drag race, which, despite all the buildup and everything, Bob wins. But Tim, in one of his more humble moments on the series, accepts defeat graciously and in perspective. He says, "Yeah, Bob beat me, but then I realized the difference. He bought his. Someone else engineered it for it. I built mine from the ground up. I built it myself. I got it running, and it kept up with him." That's not to take too much away from Forrest Gump directly. As Mark and I have agreed, it is indeed a visual landmark. However, I have this serious soft spot for movies that are able to do a lot with very little. Mark pointed out that Shawshank is one man who maybe doesn't undergo a dramatic physical transformation or necessarily even a personality over the course of his 20 years, compared to Tom Hanks diving in to some of America's most colorful and tumultuous moments in history. And he's right. Shawshank is set in a single prison, in an environment that, well, nowadays, given that this is 2018 and we're down to the last few members of that generation who are left, most people wouldn't even remember being alive in 1947 and what the state of the world was when he went in. Those who would have been alive in the late 60s when Andy escaped and when Red was released, even that generation is dying out or being aged into nursing homes. That's true. But the thing is, externally, no. Until the end of the movie, we're not taken to some far-flung locale. It's more so being astounded at the journey that we see Andy Dufresne and Red and their fellow inmates all experience from the inside reflected outward. In their deeds, in their action, the subtlety, how some are worn down to their breaking point like Brooks, while others are reborn like Red and Andy. And seeing how, really, as you see that expressed, as they adapt and survive and discover hope, how those are really universes that we see opened up in the subtlety in those men's eyes, in their presences. Me English good tonight. In their demeanors. It's an extremely subtle kind of craft that brings the best out of that $25 million that they had to spend and is determined to still extract the most emotional marrow out of this story, despite the fact that they couldn't count on a blockbuster A-list cast because everybody who was interested in it either thought it was too small time, had another project lined up, thought Frank Darabont was too inexperienced, they were going to do it, but then all of a sudden they just exploded because of the success of another movie. Did the Shawshank Redemption lose out to the Oscar Beatty hot rod at the finish line? Yes. Yes, it did. Not gonna lie, Forrest Gump took the checkered flag. But at the end of the day, they also didn't look at the movie and think to themselves, we have something here that we just don't see anymore, that we haven't seen much of in decades. They took a terribly unpopular genre of movie, and they managed to make something that might have drawn a bad hand in terms of what it had to compete with at the box office. But I think a lot of people even then maybe should have realized this is something that we're one day going to look at the way we look at Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Captain's Courageous, Sergeant York. Hell, if we're talking about movies about incarceration of any kind, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Birdman of Alcatraz, movies such as that, and say years later, man, it holds up. It's a classic for a reason, and it doesn't need the modern tools that a lot of movies nowadays have to depend on. It is absolutely no less for the absence of contemporary trappings. And that is why, with all due respect to Forrest Gump, Shawshank Redemption was almost hands down 1995's Best Picture, statuette or not.
All right. I think we're just going to, just to give this a sort of end piece, and this doesn't have to be the sort of stilted my turn, your turn. We can just talk.
Yeah.
The funny thing is there's a lot of similarities, but in very ways they're just different movies. And I totally get the argument over, Forrest Gump is sort of Oscar bait. But I think the strongest argument in favor of it is its relatability. That it is universal relatability versus I think Shawshank or Pulp Fiction or even Jurassic World, where some people aren't going to get any of those movies.
Yeah.
That's my argument for why it should win an Oscar. I think one could argue that relatability has nothing to do with anything, but that's sort of my criteria at least.
Well, and if we were talking about the actual legal system, to be honest, I would have been morally compelled to recuse myself for this one. Because I remember that I loved the movie already, even when I was younger. I adored this movie from the first time I saw it in junior high right through high school. What really cemented it as my all-time favorite was in 2011, when I had lost two straight very dear relationships to me, one of which lasted 10 years from my senior year of high school right up until I was shortly before my 28th birthday. We were engaged at the time, but I had to come to the realization that, neither one of us was strictly at fault, but the relationship just wasn't going to work. After that, I ended up in a relationship with somebody that I, to this day, consider the absolute love of my life. But the timing for us to be together was just wrong, because I was still too damaged from a lot of the years of my previous relationship. And it simply wasn't going to work. And right around the same time, what I had considered my dream career was turning out to be something that was making me miserable. As I was being mired in escalating depression, and feeling just lost, I got laid off from the newspaper that I worked for, which I had thought would be the start to my dream livelihood, being a reporter, what I had always wanted since high school, and it was making me miserable. I didn't have a college degree because I had left a semester early to take that full-time job. and so I wasn't qualified for most of the other jobs that I wanted. I was just the Midwest in general was making me feel stuck. It was making me feel like there was no way out of being reminded of everything that hadn't worked out for the past few years, or it made me miserable. And the very same person that I had just broken up with, the second relationship, not the first one, had always said, I could see you really liking it out here in Arizona. I think that would be good for you. I don't think where you are is really making you happy. And at the time, I was broke. I couldn't afford to keep paying my rent. Right before I briefly moved to Wichita for the first time, that same friend and I, through entirely fault of my own, had a falling out that I didn't think we would recover from. I was hopelessly guilt-stricken by that. But the entire time, I believed something about that movie just kind of always kept calling me back to it. And it made me realize, you may feel miserable where you are right now, but if you can hold on, you can find a way to something. If it's not better, it's at least a fresh start. There's no guarantee it's going to be perfect, and it wasn't, and it probably won't be when I go back there again. But it's a chance. It's giving myself an opportunity and making the best of it, and realizing that indeed, no matter how miserable I was where I physically was, or where I was personally or socially, I could still hold on to something in my own head and just scrape by until I could turn that around and get away from everything that was making me unhappy. And so, Arizona was, and kind of is, it was my Zihuatanejo. It's my place with no memory, where I'm just a new person. I don't have to live up to necessarily anybody else or anything else around me, or any past history where I wouldn't feel like not a fish out of water so much as a fish in a strange fish bowl where it didn't want to be. But all the while, I first had to resolve that I wasn't going to let being someplace where I didn't want to be change me for the worst. And it's something that I still grapple with to this day, and it's why I still love this movie. It's because it does, as much as, and Forrest Gump does too, to a certain extent. The whole idea of whatever you're doing, do it because you enjoy it. Give it your all. Yeah. But when you're somebody who deals with mental illness at all times, it really is a matter of those moments when you do feel isolated, when you do feel entirely alone, and you do have to sometimes escape into your own head and realize, hey, no matter what's going on out there, there are places in here that are impenetrable. That's the part that's stuck with me. And I just realized maybe part of it even comes back to what Scarlett once said to me, and that is, you've heard me say it 100 times, hundreds of times. You'll hear me say it hundreds more, folks. Is never dull your colors for someone else's canvas. It's not etched across my shoulders for no reason. It's not a catchphrase. It's not something that just sounded good. It's something that I couldn't not believe in, and that's everything that to me this movie stands for. And it's a testament to it, to just how flexible and how truly relatable the meat of it is to anybody. Is that anyone from any experience can watch that journey and take away something, maybe not literally from being in prison, but at least take something away metaphorically that they may very well carry with them to their dying day. So that's my thoughts on it.
Okay, so I think as an experiment, this worked out pretty well. It's hard. So much of the show has been, tear apart a movie, at least for me. It was hard to not immediately go there. But by the same token, what's there to tear apart of the Shawshank Redemption?
Right.
So it was. So I thought it was interesting. I said occasionally we do a show that really stretches your ability to construct an argument without just trashing the subject. So yeah, if this particular motif fits for something else, we'll have to do it again. In the meantime, in between time, next up on the docket for On Trial is Dances with Wolves, and that will be, let's see, now you will get fun. More of me and Sean.
The word you're looking for is fun.
If you're looking for more of me and Sean, as we talked earlier, Sean and I will be reviewing Glow Season 2 on July 26th. There'll be no On Trial, but you'll get some TV party tonight for me and Sean talking Glow. And then you get a double dose of me and Sean in August, where a triple dose, as a matter of fact. No, double dose. We'll be doing the Orange is the New Black Season 6, I believe, and that's going to be on August 6th. We're going to talk about that. And then On Trial returns with Dances with Wolves on the 13th. And then after that, in the month of September, Sean and I will get two On Trials for the price of one. We're going to do Barbed Wire with Pamela Anderson. I'm sure that'll be a blast. I can't wait for that. I've been waiting all year for this. And then Predators on September 20th. Mm-hmm. And if you're listening, David Wright, I've rescheduled Lost in Space to September 25th. So there. And the month of October, because it's Halloween, you see, we're going to be doing, now this is Sean's pick for the month of October. The On Trial will be October 30th, and it's Halloween 2 from 1981, just in time for the new Halloween movie that no longer acknowledges Halloween 2 as canon, which is fantastic. So that all worked out very well. And then in November, we've got, let's see here. We've got nothing. We've got no On Trials at all. We've got some Damn You Hollywoods, though, so that's good. Oh, yeah. But however, okay, I remember how that happened. We had a whole bunch of things move is what happened. So we actually have a bunch in December. We have Rocky IV on December 6th. We have Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner on the 13th. And then finally, we're closing out the year with Jingle All the Way on December 18th. So that's 3 On Trials. We have 3 On Trials for the month of December. Can you handle it, Sean?
Oh, hell yeah.
All right. And then we'll be back in January.
I'll be back in Arizona by that time.
And then we'll be back in January with On Trial Hellboy 2, The Golden Shower, or whatever it was called.
Golden Army, dear God, man. Okay, now you really have me worried you're going to end up watching the wrong movie. I'm afraid you're going to go to Pornhub or something.
Well, I found this movie fascinating. There's an awful lot of
I found an entirely different cut than you did. How did yours not contain the male female three-way scene?
Exactly. Like, Sean, I don't know what movie you were watching, but mine had a lot of sex in it.
Oh God, it's going to be the Highlander debate all over again.
The Golden Army. Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, just in time for the new Hellboy reboot. So, that's all the on-trials that's fit to print, and anything else we're doing with Sean, unless something else comes up. All right, Sean, go plug your Twitching.
Oh, actually, for the time being, I'm focusing so much on work and classes right now that until sort of further notice, so to speak, I'm kind of putting everything on hold. I've even set my Twitter to private, and I'm not much on social media these days. I've got some other stuff I'm going to be doing. I'll be doing some podcasts on w2mnet.com during E3 next week. To talk about all the blockbuster gaming news that's going to be spilling forth. In the meantime, if you really can't get enough of me and you want to hang for a while, I would say if you want to play some Overwatch or Dead by Daylight on PlayStation 4, my PSN ID is Sean C. Comer. Send me an invite. Mention you heard me on the Rodlich and Broadcasting Network, and I'll see if I can make some time to squad up. I'm trying to enjoy the last little bit of the Overwatch anniversary event, and I need good teammates. So. That's really about it. Otherwise, I will say thank you for enduring me getting a little bit misty-eyed over this classic movie, but I've wanted to talk about why I love it so much for a long time. And otherwise, I will just say you have been a lovely audience. Mark, you have been a fine pseudo-legal counterpart. And never dull your colors for someone else's canvas until the next time I see you in the courtroom.
All right, folks, all rise. This has been On Trial with your hosts, Mark and Sean. We'll be back, as I said, in a few weeks. Until then, court is in recess. Be well, be safe, and behave.